rather than possibly going into a depression, rather than having your favorite president be Herbert Hoover. I was always the one I didn't want to be. I didn't want to see economic catastrophe. If you kept this going, that could have happened. But all I know is every time we talked about the possibility of peace, the stock market shot up like a rocket ship. It never went down. They didn't like it. The people, the stock market is more brilliant than anybody there is, including the people on the stage, other than me, of course.
That is the person who represents all of us Americans on the world stage. That was Donald Trump on the world stage yesterday, rambling, insulting his own cabinet, praising the stock market, confessing that his foreign policy is driven by the stock market's reaction to it, and importantly for this conversation, admitting that more than anything else, he does not want to go down as Herbert Hoover, or a president whose war caused an economic calamity. The fear that he told us, pushed him to reach a deal to finally end his wildly unpopular war with Iran without any geopolitical or strategic gains for the United States of America. But 4 months into that war, there's a devastating new poll out today that shows Donald Trump's economic approval rating has hit a remarkable new low, with a large majority of the country dissatisfied with him on the economy. 1/3 of Americans say they approve of how Trump is handling the economy. That's lower than his predecessor, President Joe Biden, was at any point. That's lower than Donald Trump was at any point in his first term, including the COVID pandemic. Overall, just 36% of Americans approve of how Donald Trump is handling his job as president. I want to bring in Democratic pollster and political analyst Cornell Belcher. John Heilman is back with us. Cornell, I'm like running out of the will to ask insightful questions. I mean, what WTF? I mean, I don't even know what to say about what Donald Trump says anymore about not wanting to be Herbert Hoover, revealing that the stock market is stronger than his cabinet in his view. Maybe that's why he asked another world leader about going to war with Iran. But the truth is found anytime you go shopping for anything, whether you do like your family's big, fill the fridge shopping, or whether you run in to get something you forgot for dinner. Everything is a whole lot more expensive. And even if gas prices come down, you've been paying so much more for so many months now. People are already changing their summer plans. What does the pro-democracy side, the Democratic Party, do with that?
Well, first, Nicole, don't you often wonder during those press conferences? I always find myself watching Secretary Rubio, and because you always think, what's going on in Rubio's mind during these rambling? And he just, to me, it's hilarious. But picking up on that topic about the peace plan and that conversation, interview just had, devastating interview you just had, laying out how problematic this war is. In that Fox poll, we have 64% of Americans who disapprove of the war. So it's not really the one thing; it is the tie. It is the economic end, but it's also all these other things that are just weighing it down. And I think it really becomes, he's being stripped bare, because now it's not just independence. Look, 64% of independents disapprove. Right? You have the vast majority of independents approve. But what I think was remarkable in the new polling that's out over the last couple of days, Nicole, is look, Trump won non-college white voters by better than 30 points. He won rural voters by better. His job on the economy is now underwater with both of those sets of voters.
Yeah.
And he just barely broke ahead in 2024 among suburban voters. And 60-some% of suburban voters now disapprove of the job that the president's doing. So it is not just cracking, but it's crumbling around it.
Yeah, I mean, Heilman, I too wonder what Rubio, who got in a fight with Donald Trump about the size of his hands, is thinking when he stands there. But I think it has a whole lot to do with measuring the drapes in the Oval Office. But what do you?
So there's. He's thinking, Nicole, about whether he could top his own rhetoric earlier this week when he compared the UFC to America landing on the moon under John F. Kennedy. I think he's kind of trying to think up the next great rhetorical flourish that will guarantee him a spot in the world in the White House.
Who needs USAID when you've got the UFC insulting former first ladies?
He's also sitting there thinking, thank God I'm not J.D. Vance. My God, just praise the Lord that I can stand back here quietly in the back and look like I'm on Ibogaine, like one of those very heavily dissociative hallucinogens that people take when they don't move for hours, where they're like stuck in one place like a tree trunk. That's, I think he's just basically saying, at least they're not fitting me for cement shoes like they are J.D. Vance.
And what about the economy, Highland?
Well, I just want to talk about Hoover a little bit, because why not? First of all, what president wants to be like Herbert Hoover? None that I've ever heard of before. I think Hoover's got to be on Trump's mind, though, because he knows that as soon as his presidency ends, the discussion of who is the worst president in American history will begin. And as of now, I would say there's kind of a consensus Hoover, is right at the bottom of everybody's list. And there will be a long going debate that will, probably for the rest of Donald Trump's years on planet Earth and long beyond, there'll be a question about who is worse for America, Herbert Hoover or Donald Trump. And so he's clearly already playing that competition out in his mind, Nicole. I think that's as always, Trump, confession or projection, one or the other, always. In this case, I think a little bit of both.
Totally. Oh, I want to be part of those conversations, though, because I think the guy that brought back the measles, that destroyed USAID, that destroyed America's standing on the world, that destroyed America's economy, that destroyed the Justice Department, the military, and the FBI, like in 1 week, beats Herbert Hoover running away.